To acquire a database connection from the connection pool, we first connect to the naming service, then look up for the data source, and then we get the connection. So Tomcat, when it starts, it will create a pool of connections and it will put it in the naming service as this data source. So we need to look up for this in the naming service, get the data source, and then from that data source we can get any number of connections from the pool. So let's create a dynamic web application and see connection pooling in action. Go to the file menu, say new, dynamic web project, call it connection pooling, finish. Right click on the SRC folder, new, servlet, connection, package name will be com.bharath.trainings.servlets.cp for connection pooling. You can also say JDBC.cp, doesn't matter. It's important that you understand that it's connection pooling. Class name is connection pooling servlet. Finish. We'll implement the doGet method so that we can access this servlet using a URL. Hit Ctrl D to delete the to do. Inside it, the first step is to connect to the naming service. We do that using new initial context. This is the object that will allow us to, or this is the class that allows us to connect to the naming service. Hit Ctrl 1 to import it from javax.naming. This is the JNDI API. Ctrl 1 to handle any exceptions. Try catch. So it throws a naming exception. Ctrl D to delete that. Assign this to a local variable. We can also, instead of assigning it to initial context, you can also assign it to context. It is a parent interface. Ctrl 1, import that. Let's call this context instead of initial context. Once we have the naming service, so Tomcat at runtime, when we invoke this constructor internally initializes everything, all the resources, and it will load all this. All that implementation is in there. We need not worry about it. Now we need to look up context dot lookup is the method, and we need to pass in the name. Typically we would just pass in my DS. That is the name we have configured in here, but there is a root element or a root name for the naming service. In case of Java EE, it is a standard. So we should start with Java component comp/env/. So this part Java comp/env is mandatory, and it's a Java standard. Any application server you go, this will be the root context, and whatever resources we create, we will create relative to that. We'll assign this to a data source DS. Ctrl 1, import this data source from javax.sql package. And since context.lookup always returns an object, hit Ctrl 1. We should typecast the object to data source, because we know that whatever comes back from here is a data source. We have asked Tomcat to create a data source, because for connection pooling, we need a data source object. Back to the servlet. Once we have a data source, we can get any number of connections from it. So data source is a replacement of driver manager. When we get single connections and we take care of connections on our own, we use a driver manager. But in case of connection pooling, we use data source in that place. ds.getConnection. We need not pass any information. The connection is already available. Add a catch class to the surrounding try. We need to handle SQL exception. Hit Ctrl D to delete the to do block. Point your cursor to this ds.getConnection. Ctrl 1. Assign statement to a new local variable, and that gives us the connection. Simply sys out, Control space, display the connection on the console. Control D, Control Shift F to format. So let's see this in action and then we can go through the flow. Right click, run on server, finish. So when Tomcat starts now, while it's starting, it reads this context.xml and it creates this resource and a pool of connections by using this URL string, password, etc. And it puts this data source inside the naming service with this name. And when our servlet is run, we are accessing the naming service using new initial context. And in that naming service, this is the root. And after that, we are asking for the data source. We are getting the data source back. From the data source, we are doing a get connection to get one single connection. We can get any number of connections. Now let's look at the console. And there we go. Here is our connection. Our sysout has printed our connection information, the connection object on the console.